At 3 a.m. on January 24th, 1942, 4 American destroyers launched a surprise raid on a Japanese invasion fleet at Balikpapan in Borneo. For an hour, they rampaged across an unsuspecting fleet of transports, winning the US Navy's first victory in the Pacific War. This is how they did it. As the United States Navy's Pacific Fleet reeled from the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, thousands of miles to the west, the Asiatic Fleet was under immediate threat. Commanded by Admiral Thomas Hart, the Asiatic Fleet was in theory one of the Navy's 3 main formations, along with the Pacific and Atlantic fleets. In reality, it was a small and outdated force, consisting of only the heavy cruiser Houston, light cruisers Boise and Marblehead, 13 old Clemson-class destroyers, and 29 submarines. Within days, as the Japanese invasion of the Philippines unfolded disastrously for the US, it became clear that the fleet could not stay based out of Manila. Admiral Hart was forced to move his ships south, to the Dutch-controlled port of Surabaya. From there, he was given the task of trying to prevent or at least delay the Japanese invasion of the Netherlands East Indies, working together with British, Australian and Dutch forces. This was a daunting task, as heading straight for this part of the world was Vice Admiral Ibo Takahashi's Eastern Force, with the carrier Ryuho, 4 Miyako-class heavy cruisers, the light cruiser Naka, and 19 destroyers. On top of this were powerful land-based aircraft flotillas which held growing air superiority. After assisting with the occupation of Mindanao in the Philippines, Vice Admiral Takahashi's ships proceeded south, landing troops at Jolo on December 25th and Minada on January 11th. The following day, a destroyer division under Rear Admiral Nishimura completed the capture of Tarakan in northeastern Borneo, yielding the Japanese an important airbase and staging area to push further south to Balikpapan. Admiral Hart was keen to use his ships to prevent further Japanese advance here, despite being outgunned, knowing that if the enemy got a hold of airbases at Balikpapan and Kendari, then their base at Surabaya would be within range of air attack. On January 20th, Dutch intelligence reported a Japanese convoy moving south in the Makassar Strait. Hart assembled a task force to sortie and confront this force, but was frustrated when Marblehead developed engine trouble and Boise ran into a coral reef, gouging a massive hole in its side and forcing the withdrawal of the cruiser to India for repairs. This was a huge blow to the American naval presence, since Boise had been not only the most powerful ship in Hart's fleet arguably, but also the only one equipped with radar, something which would be sorely missed at the disastrous Battle of the Java Sea in late February 1942. As 2 destroyers were detached to escort the cruisers away, this left just 4 destroyers in the American striking force heading northwards. On January 22nd, reports came in from a Catalina reconnaissance aircraft and from the submarine USS Pike of large numbers of Japanese transport and escort vessels heading for Balikpapan. Despite knowing they'd probably be heavily outnumbered, Admiral Hart was determined that the 4 destroyers under Commander Paul Talbot should take the opportunity to engage the invasion flotillas. At 12:05 p.m. on January 23rd, Hart signalled Talbot, "Attack enemy off Balikpapan." Talbot was informed that his 4 ships could be facing 2 cruisers and at least 8 destroyers, a huge mismatch. To even the odds, he would count on a high-speed attack made at night with the element of surprise. Through the afternoon, he kept his ships heading northeast, drifting towards the coastline of Celebes in the hopes of deceiving any Japanese aircraft as to his true destination. As it was, no hostile planes appeared, and at 7:30 p.m, safely under the cover of darkness, he swung the destroyers around and headed in a straight line at top speed for Balikpapan. As they steamed across the strait, Commander Talbot signalled his ships to order them to avoid firing their guns initially so as not to give their position away, and only open fire once all torpedoes had been expended. He urged his ships to use own discretion in attacking independently when targets located, use initiative and determination. By midnight, the flotilla was approaching the coast, and the western sky began to glow orange, lit by oil wells set ablaze by the Dutch defenders in the face of Japanese landings. The American destroyers could also see a fire that was much, much closer to their north. This was the transport Nana Maru, which had been struck by bombs from a Dutch air raid some hours before and been abandoned while still afloat. A Dutch submarine was also operating in the area that night, and at 12:45 am it managed to torpedo and damage the transport Suruga Maru, closer to the shoreline. This attack triggered a huge response from the Japanese escorts under Rear Admiral Shoji Nishimura aboard the light cruiser Naka, who ordered his 11 destroyers to join in the hunt for the submarine to the south. Nishimura had no idea that by doing so he was clearing the way for Talbot's incoming destroyers, which actually made visual contact with some of Nishimura's ships just after 2:30 am. In the darkness, the Japanese ships initially thought they had encountered some of their own, and the last ship in the line signalled the US flagship John D. Ford to inquire as to their identity. Commander Talbot ignored this and kept on his course, and the enemy destroyers soon faded away into the night without turning to investigate the unknown vessels. A few minutes later, at 2:45 am, the Japanese transports began to come into view. They were arranged in two neat lines, stationary and silhouetted against the fires raging ashore. It was the perfect setup for torpedo attacks. USS Parrot, the third ship in the line, was the first to engage, launching 3 torpedoes from its port side at an anchored ship. Its crew counted down the time until impact, but were rewarded only with silence. They tried again, this time spotting the Japanese minesweeper W-15 to their starboard side and firing 5 torpedoes, but again, no hits. It was the same story for the others. The John D. Ford and Paul Jones both engaged hostiles and neither scored a hit. The destroyer crews had heard that their submariner colleagues had been struggling with defective torpedoes, but had hoped the same flaws did not apply to their own. They were to be disappointed. By now it was 3 am and the American ships had passed by the line of transports. Commander Talbot ordered a sharp turn to starboard, to swing his force around for a second attack run. Just as it was turning, Parrot loosed 3 torpedoes at another transport, the Sumanura Maru. This time there was a large explosion that cheered the destroyer crews and alerted the Japanese to their presence. W-15 signalled Rear Admiral Nishimura to report the explosion and sightings of potentially hostile destroyers, but Nishimura did not believe that enemy ships could have entered the anchorage undetected, and continued to believe that he was only dealing with an Allied submarine. By now, Talbot's ships had completed their turn to the south, and were ready to engage the transports again. They were in a strong position, right in the middle of the Japanese ships, meaning their opponents could not safely engage them for fear of hitting friendly ships in the darkness. The ammunition ship Satsukami Maru was the first in the firing line, targeted from 3:06 am by Pope, Parrot and Paul Jones, resulting in 1 hit and an enormous explosion. The destroyers swept southwards as torpedoes were reloaded, and Talbot then decided to force the issue. At 3:14 am he swung the ships to starboard, pressing closer to the Japanese ships. 5 minutes later, Pope and Parrot spotted the patrol boat PB-37 to their south. 5 torpedoes were fired in quick succession. 3 were hits, and PB-37 sank quickly. Ahead of them, the John D. Ford loosed a torpedo at the freighter Kuretake Maru, but this Japanese ship had managed to get underway and was able to avoid it. Talbot was undeterred, looping around to the south now to line up a shot at the Kuretake from Ford's port tubes. But before they could fire another torpedo, Paul Jones did so, and scored a devastating hit. After these engagements, Paul Jones joined Parrot and Pope in having used up all of their torpedoes. Talbot ordered them to open up with their guns as the line pushed north again, and targets to the west were peppered with shells as they passed by. At 3:35 am, the John D. Ford again turned to the west, heading straight for the line of transports closest to the shoreline. But unwittingly, Talbot's line was now on a collision course with the burnt-out hulk of the Nana Maru. The fire on this ship had reduced enough to make it almost invisible until the last second. Ford's captain, Lieutenant Commander Jacob Cooper, swung his ship hard to port to avoid a collision, cutting speed as he did so. The USS Pope did the same, but was surprised by the Ford's sudden drop in speed and was forced to turn even harder to the west to go around its now near stationary leader. Parrott and Paul Jones turned the other way, hauling around to starboard. Finding themselves suddenly out of contact with Ford and Pope, these two ships could not now resume firing for fear of hitting their own side, so they continued the turn until they were heading south and disengaged from the fight. The USS Pope did the same, looping around to follow the others south. The John D. Ford and Commander Talbot were not finished though. Still with some torpedoes to fire, the destroyer got going again, pressing west towards the inner line of transports. At 3:46 am, it loosed 3 torpedoes on its port side at the Saruga Maru, the ship that had earlier been damaged by the Dutch submarine. One hit was scored and Saruga Maru was finished off. With its torpedoes now expended, Ford turned the attention of its guns to the Asahi Maru to its north, only to find out to its surprise that this particular transport could fire back. At 3:47, Asahi Maru scored a hit on the American destroyer, starting a fire that was quickly suppressed and wounding 4 crewmen. Ford retaliated with a hail of gunfire as it steamed by, wounding 50 sailors on board the Japanese ship. Next in the firing line was Tamagawa Maru, which was equally battered, but Commander Talbot could now see the shoreline rapidly approaching and judged it might be time to turn around or risk getting grounded. He swung Ford around to port, charting a course back through the lines of Japanese ships and out towards where his other destroyers had gone. Talbot asked for maximum speed, and the Ford, a more than 20-year-old destroyer don't forget, reached 32 knots as it hared its way back to the southeast. The American commander was concerned about Japanese escort ships catching up to him, but he need not have worried. Rear Admiral Nishimura was still off to the southwest, hunting for a Dutch submarine that had long since dived to the seabed to wait out the action. The Americans got clean away. In just over an hour of carnage, the 4 destroyers had sunk 4 out of the 14 Japanese transports present at Balikpapan for the cost of only a few sailors wounded. It was an embarrassing poke in the eye for the Japanese, and the first victory for the US Navy in the war against Japan. In some ways, though, it was disappointing. Only 4 sinkings from the American ship that encountered no meaningful resistance for over an hour was poor, resulting from ships occasionally targeting the same transports as each other and thus wasting torpedoes, and from the faulty torpedoes themselves failing to explode. This was an issue affecting Mark 14 torpedoes across the Navy, severely impacting the effectiveness of US submarines for the first 2 years of the Pacific War. In the short term, it meant that the Japanese advance was only delayed for a day or two due to the events at Balikpapan, and it quickly resumed. The Allied naval forces in the East Indies would continue to resist valiantly, but against impossible odds, culminating in the Battle of the Java Sea and the destruction of the Allied presence in Southeast Asia.